When I slipped on black ice that February morning, the first call I made was to Clarice. My hip was fractured. My pride bruised deeper. I didn't want to ask for help, but Clarice insisted. Come stay with us, Mom. Just until you're steady again. I packed light 2 suitcases, a few books, and my spice tins, and told myself it was temporary. The first few days were kind. Clarice made oatmeal the way I liked it, with cinnamon and almond milk. Ellie helped me up the stairs at night, careful not to make me feel fragile. Even Bert offered to install a grab bar in the shower. I felt like I still belonged. But that feeling didn't last. By the end of the week, Clarice told me Judith was arriving. She's just recovering from that shoulder procedure, she said. We'll set her up in the guest room. I blinked. That had been my room. They moved me into the sunroom, 4 glass walls, no insulation, and a folding cot that creaked when I shifted. Just until she's back on her feet, Clarice repeated. I didn't argue. I was still healing. From the fall, from the quiet distance, I hadn't realized had grown between us. Judith arrived with matching luggage silk pajamas and a half-used bottle of designer hand cream. She gave me a quick nod, then air-kissed Clarice and cooed over Ellie's haircut. Within hours, she was settled in bathroom-stocked slippers by the bedroom diffuser, misting lavender like it was a spa. The same evening, she sipped tea from Clarice's antique china, while I drank from a chipped mug I'd found in the cabinet. Ellie noticed. She always noticed. She left a post-it on my pillow that night. I'm glad you're here, Grandma. Just 5 words, but they held me more gently than the cot did. I thought maybe things would even out. Maybe I was imagining the imbalance. But then the next morning, I found a crisp white envelope on my breakfast plate with my name written across the front. The handwriting was unmistakably Clarice's bold all caps, with the same slanted R she'd used on her 4th grade science fair project. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the flap. Inside was a printed sheet typed and formatted like a lease agreement. Monthly household contribution, $900. A breakdown followed utilities, shared groceries, maintenance, and something called space usage. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to believe it was real. Clarice came into the kitchen a few minutes later, breezing past me to grab the French press. Oh, saw the envelope. It's just what we discussed, remember. Helps keep things balanced now that we've got 2 households under one roof. Her tone was light casual. She didn't meet my eyes. Judith entered right behind her, draped in a robe, hair still wrapped in a towel. Clarice, darling, could we do almond croissants next week? These store-bought ones are a bit dry. She didn't acknowledge me. I stirred my tea with slow, deliberate motions and said nothing. I didn't remind Clarice that I'd brought my own groceries last week. I didn't mention that I'd folded every piece of laundry the night before while Judith scrolled on her tablet. I didn't argue about the thermostat I wasn't allowed to touch. I simply returned to my sunroom and opened the small lockbox under my cot. I counted the cash I'd withdrawn the month before, just in case. I took out 9 crisp hundreds and tucked them into a plain white envelope. No note. No label. I left it on the counter. That night, Ellie came into the sunroom holding something behind her back. I made you this, she said, and handed me a drawing. It was me sitting beneath a blooming tree, smiling, a book in my lap. At the bottom, she'd written, I hope you find your tree, Grandma. I ran my finger over the leaves she'd colored one by one. Then I placed the drawing beside my pillow and turned out the light. The next morning, I found Judith's slippers by the guest bathroom door and a handwritten sign taped just above the handle, private use only. Clarice hosted a dinner party that Friday. Bert had just been promoted, and she wanted to celebrate in style. The dining table gleamed with polished silverware, and she arranged orchids as centerpieces. Judith wore pearls and a silk blouse that still had the boutique tag hanging under her collar. I noticed it only because she turned just so while laughing at one of Bert's jokes. I wasn't asked to sit at the table. Clarice said, "Mom, would you mind helping in the kitchen? You always plate things so beautifully." I nodded, put on the apron, and filled the water glasses. I served the salmon, poured the wine, and refilled the salad bowls. Judith never moved from her chair. They toasted without me. I heard the glasses clink from the hallway as I rinsed dishes and set them to dry on a towel. When I stepped into the living room to gather dessert plates, Judith turned slightly and said, "You know, Clarice, it's so generous of you to take in your mother. Not everyone would do that." Clarice smiled politely but said nothing. I returned to the kitchen and finished washing the last pan. The champagne bottle was nearly empty when I brought out the dessert tray. Clarice kissed Judith on the cheek and whispered something that made them both laugh. I stood back, hands still damp, watching from the corner. Later that night, I tiptoed to the guest bathroom. The main one was upstairs and I didn't want to wake anyone. But taped across the guest door was a paper sign, in Clarice's handwriting, "Private use only." I walked back through the silent house and used the half bath near the laundry room, the one with flickering lights and no lock. The next morning, as I shuffled back into the kitchen, Clarice smiled and said, "Oh, Mom, we need to talk about the lawn maintenance. They raised their rates this season." She slid another paper toward me. I nodded, picked it up with steady fingers, and walked back to my sunroom. From beneath my cot, I retrieved my lockbox and started counting out the bills again. The bill Clarice handed me was precise $40.50 for window cleaning and an added $30 for shared landscaping services. I didn't ask why the math didn't include Judith's share. I didn't ask who approved the work. I simply returned to my sunroom, unlocked the tin box, and pulled out exactly $70.50 in cash. I pressed the envelope flat and laid it neatly on the kitchen counter beside the coffee machine. Clarice found it before breakfast. She didn't say thank you. She never did. Judith wandered in minutes later wearing one of Clarice's monogrammed robes and sighed loudly. "You know, darling, the air in that sunroom must be awful for your mother's joints. I read somewhere that older bones really need warmth." Clarice hummed as she poured her smoothie. "Well, the guest room's full, and the contractors won't be done insulating the attic for another month." I sat quietly at the table, my tea lukewarm. Judith's smoothie was served in crystal. Mine was in a cracked mug with fading sunflowers. When they left for the day, Judith to her garden club and Clarice to show homes, I stayed behind. I opened my notebook and began making a list. Not a grocery list. Not bills. Addresses. Appointments. Quiet inquiries I'd already made weeks ago. The truth was, I'd never needed to stay here. I had savings. I had options. What I didn't have was certainty until now. A month earlier, before the snow had melted, I'd seen a small brick cottage listed in Eldersburg. A single-story home with a backyard garden and a porch swing. I'd asked a favor from an old friend, Mr. Drexler. He said he'd handle it quietly. And he had. The deposit was already paid. Closing was scheduled for next week, in full. No mortgage, no strings. That evening, while Ellie sketched in her notebook across from me, she asked softly, "Grandma, why are you smiling?" I didn't answer. I just placed a lemon drop on her sketch pad. A silent, "Thank you." She grinned, and without asking, passed me a folded paper she'd been hiding behind her elbow. The paper Ellie handed me was thicker than notebook stock watercolor, maybe. On it, she'd drawn a bench beneath a blooming tree, shaded with soft purples and greens. A little figure sat with a book in her lap. I recognized the cardigan, the bun of white hair. It was me. At the bottom, she'd written, "You'll find your place again." My throat tightened. I ran a finger gently over the drawing and folded it into the back of my journal. Later that night, I went digging through the old boxes Clarice had shoved into the garage. She said she'd meant to sort them, but they sat there untouched for months. Among dusty tax folders and bent photo albums, I found what I'd been looking for: a small, cracked jewelry box wrapped in an old tea towel. Inside was the receipt for my wedding ring. I had sold it years ago quietly to fund Clarice's trip to a conservatory audition. She'd been 17 and full of dreams that didn't survive the first round. But I'd never told her what I gave up to send her. She never asked. I tucked the receipt beside Ellie's drawing, one forgotten gift, one newly given. The next morning, I helped Ellie make pancakes while Clarice took a call in the other room. Judith was still asleep. Ellie stirred the batter and said, "I think you'd like a house with a porch, Grandma." I looked at her sideways. "Why's that?" She shrugged. "Because porches mean you don't need to leave home to be outside. That's what you always say." I smiled. She remembered. The words I used as bedtime lessons had taken root in her more than I realized. That afternoon, Clarice left another envelope on my nightstand. This one included a breakdown of spring costs, mulch deck stain, and shared fence maintenance. I didn't flinch. I added the total and returned the payment by dinner time, just as Ellie handed me another surprise: a painted tile with the same blooming tree. Only now there were two figures on the bench. One larger, one smaller, both smiling beneath a lavender sky. Sunday brunch was Clarice's favorite performance. She plated fruit like she was arranging a magazine cover and sprinkled microgreens on scrambled eggs. Judith arrived at the table wearing coral lipstick and pearls, even though she never left the house on Sundays. Bert offered mimosas. Ellie poured juice and I, as usual, served coffee. Clarice laughed easily, spinning a story about her newest client, a very picky couple from Connecticut. Judith chimed in, adding her own advice, uninvited and misinformed, but Clarice nodded like it was gospel. I sat quietly, buttering toast no one would eat. Then Clarice lifted her glass and said, "Let's raise a toast to Mom, who always pays her rent on time." She grinned like it was a joke. Laughter erupted. Even Bert chuckled. Judith sipped her mimosa with a knowing smirk. I let them laugh. Then I set down my knife, folded my hands in my lap, and asked evenly, "So how much does Judith pay each month?" The air shifted. Forks paused midair. Ellie stared down at her plate. Bert coughed and reached for the napkins. Clarice blinked twice. Judith's glass froze just below her mouth. Clarice recovered first. "Well, it's different. She's a guest, not permanent, you know." I smiled and nodded slowly. Of course. No one spoke for the next minute. The clink of silverware never resumed. Judith mumbled something about needing her vitamins and left the table. Clarice stared at her eggs like they might save her. I excused myself and returned to the sunroom. Ellie followed a few minutes later with a fresh cup of tea and didn't say anything. She just sat beside me, legs crossed, sketchbook in her lap. That night, Clarice didn't mention the rent, but she did knock once awkwardly and say, "Let me know if you need anything." Her voice lacked its usual confidence. I thanked her, then turned back to my book. I read the same paragraph 3 times before closing it. The silence had finally become mine again. The next morning, I left early to meet Mr. Drexler downtown. I brought the documents he'd requested and a small folder of papers I'd been saving for years. The office was quiet, just the way I liked it. Mr. Drexler greeted me with that same firm handshake he'd given me every tax season for the last 2 decades. He didn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. That was what I appreciated about him most. I handed him the manila folder I'd been keeping tucked inside my purse for months. Inside were savings account statements, a cashier's check, and the preliminary contract for the Eldersburg cottage. He reviewed everything without comment, nodding once or twice. "The deed will be ready to sign by Friday," he said. "No mortgage, no liens. Clean title." I nodded. "And the trust, it's all set. Property transfers into Ellie's name on her 25th birthday. You retain life tenancy." I exhaled a long, slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the day Clarice first handed me that rent envelope. Good, I said. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need a grand speech. I only needed a door that locked from the inside and a window that opened to birdsong. The rest would come in time. Before I left, Mr. Drexler slid a second envelope across the desk. Your updated will and directives. Just in case. I placed it carefully in my purse. As I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at the hem of my coat. Still, I didn't rush. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground beneath me as mine. Back at the house, Judith was napping in the guest room, with a lavender mask over her eyes. Clarice was out showing condos. Ellie sat in the corner of the sunroom sketching another tree. I joined her, silent. She didn't ask where I'd been. That evening, while Clarice prepared dinner, I brought out the lemon pound cake I'd saved from the bakery near Drexler's office. Ellie lit a candle and sliced us each a piece. Clarice declined with a wave of her hand. Ellie leaned close and whispered, "You seem different today." I just smiled. That night I began folding my scarves and laying them carefully into my suitcase. I woke before the sun and moved through the house without a sound. Years of early library shifts had trained me well. The suitcase was already packed, scarves, folded books wrapped in cloth. Ellie's drawings tucked between sweater sleeves. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I left 2 envelopes. One was for Clarice. Inside was a handwritten note on plain stationery rent, paid in full for everything. I placed it where she always left the window cleaning bills. The second was for Ellie. I slid it under her bedroom door with care. Inside was a pressed violet from the side garden I'd tended last spring when no one noticed. I had saved it between the pages of an old botanical guide. Alongside the flower was a simple brass key and a folded note in blue ink. For when you're ready to breathe again. The cottage was ready. Mr. Drexler had sent word the night before. The final paperwork was filed. Utilities transferred, mailbox labeled. I didn't even need to pick up the key, I already had the spare. I stood in the doorway to the sunroom one last time. The cot was neatly made, the small tin box empty now. I closed the door gently behind me. By 7:00 a.m., I was on the road. No one had stirred. The driveway was silent, the porch light blinking against the early mist. I didn't look back. The drive to Eldersburg was smooth. I rolled down the windows halfway and let the breeze undo the tightness in my chest. When I arrived, the house stood waiting, small, brick, sturdy. There was a porch swing just as I remembered, and wild mint still growing beneath the mailbox. I unpacked slowly. There was no rush anymore. By noon, I'd arranged the books on the shelf and placed Ellie's tile on the windowsill. I brewed a pot of tea, the kind I used to hide in my purse. The phone rang just before 1. Clarice's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then set the phone down and stepped outside to hang the wind chimes. Clarice arrived on the 3rd afternoon unannounced. I saw her car pull into the gravel drive, tires crunching as she hesitated before turning off the engine. She sat inside for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house like it had grown out of nowhere. I met her at the porch. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired, less certain. Her lipstick was slightly smudged, and the heels she wore didn't quite suit the uneven stones. "I didn't know you were buying," she said softly. I nodded and held the door open. I didn't think I needed to explain. She stepped inside, looking around the living room. Her eyes paused on the floral tile Ellie had painted now, sitting in a wooden frame on the mantel. She reached out to touch it, but stopped short. "This place is nice," she said. "Peaceful." "It is." We stood in silence for a long moment. Then she glanced at me. "Why didn't you say anything?" I poured 2 cups of tea and carried them to the table by the window. "Because there's nothing left to explain, Clarice. You made your expectations clear." She sat slowly. I didn't mean for it to feel like that. I thought we were managing it the best way we could. I looked out the window watching a sparrow pick at the bird seed I'd scattered. You charged me rent, Clarice. You gave me invoices, and you let someone else live freely in the room I needed to heal? Clarice wrapped both hands around her cup, silent. She's still there, she finally said. Still complaining about everything. It seems like she's never truly satisfied. I gave a small smile. Then not much has changed. She looked at me like she wanted to say more, but didn't know how. Eventually, she stood smoothing her coat. Ellie's been asking to visit. Would that be okay? Always, I said. This place is as much hers as it is mine. Clarice nodded. As she left, the wind picked up, rustling the wind chimes. I sat back down, turned on the lamp, and opened Ellie's latest letter. Ellie came the next weekend, her backpack stuffed with sketch pads and her sneakers still wet from the morning dew. She ran straight into the kitchen, like she'd always lived there, dropping her things beside the table and pulling me into a tight hug that lasted longer than usual. We spent most of the day on the porch sipping iced tea and watching birds dart through the trees. She sketched the garden while I pruned the lavender. She told me Judith had started taking Clarice's car without asking, and that Clarice now spent more time in her office than in the living room. She doesn't laugh as much, Ellie said. She misses you, I think. I didn't reply. Not with words, at least. I handed her the small tin box that once held my rent money. Inside now were seeds. Lilac basil, a single sunflower. I told her they were hers to plant wherever she wanted. Later that evening, she stood beneath the oak tree at the edge of the yard, the one with the curved branch like a reaching arm. This is your tree, isn't it? She asked. I nodded. It's where you belong. She smiled and slipped the brass key from her pocket, the one I'd given her with the violet. I keep it with me, just in case. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder, and for a while we didn't say anything. The wind stirred the chimes overhead. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the sun dropped behind the hills. Clarice didn't call that weekend. I wasn't surprised. When Ellie left the next morning, she waved from the driveway and promised to bring paints next time. I stood on the porch long after she disappeared down the road. Inside, I brewed tea and placed Ellie's latest drawing on the windowsill. It was a sketch of the two of us under the blooming tree this time, with roots curling beneath the soil, strong and deep. I still live here just as before, only now no one touches this home but me.